Lisa, a 28-year-old staff sergeant who has quietly bankrolled her childhood household for years, returns home on Christmas leave only to be told by her parents and sister that she isn't wanted. Hurt, she stops paying the bills that kept the family afloat, exposes the transfers publicly, and forces a confrontation at a diner. The confrontation ends with an ally, Uncle Tom, revealing, "Oh well, that name's Lisa, heir to his property." She takes ownership, walks away from a family that treated her as expendable, and begins to build a life for herself. They put me on the red eye because it's cheaper, because the army is budget-minded, because I was told duty comes first. The plane's cabin light flicked through the window and painted strangers' faces in blue. I kept my hand on my duffel like a promise I intended to keep, home this year. The idea of Christmas had been small and stubborn in my chest all deployment, not feasts or garish trees, just one couch where a parent's knee met yours when you needed it. My phone buzzed like a live wire while the plane still tasted of jet fuel. "Christmas is better without you. Don't come." The message from my father landed like a thrown object. I read it once, twice, and then stopped counting. The words didn't vibrate. They were flat as a report. I thumbed out the simplest response I could manufacture. Understood. It felt ceremonial, like handing in a uniform. There's a strange economy to the military. Routines, checklists, chain of command. Home was supposed to be exempt. Instead, I had a ledger. Transfers, auto-pay, insurance on cars that counted as someone else's problem. I'd learned how to move money the way I learned to plan patrols, quietly, methodically, and for years my paycheck had been a bridge that kept their house from rolling into foreclosure. I never told them that. Care, for me, had been payment. By the time the plane hit ground, I had rehearsed the smile I would give, the modest surprise I'd wear when they pretended to be glad. I pictured my mother, who always seemed to misplace herself, fumbling with a chair as if rediscovering a memory. I pictured my sister Haley, hair louder than her words, saying something sharp about nothing, and me laughing because it's easier to be the air under someone else's noise than to be the truth. Instead, the runway lights blurred into motel neon. I didn't drive past the hollow lawn that used to be a yard. I rolled into a room with paper-thin walls, the kind that let you overhear other people's arguments the second you switched on the shower. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. Habit is an odd kind of prayer. Login, accounts, transfers. The joint utility account, my name listed as temporary contact somewhere a decade ago, still showed active autopay. Car insurance, mortgage portal, a docket of small monthly handshakes between my bank and their comfort. Nobody had asked for my name to be on the loan. Nobody had told me I'd become the mortgage's pulse when they needed oxygen. When I flipped the switch on the transfers, there was a mechanical hum, a confirmation screen, the little green check like a stamp. No fireworks. No catharsis. Just the soft clack of keys. I thought of how often omission counts for violence, how silence can compound into debt. I thought about the times I had been the house's quiet anesthetic, wiring money in the middle of the night, checking the balance of a savings account at odd hours, swallowing pride like tough bread. I closed the laptop and let the motel's thin curtains make a small, shadowed room. For the first time in years, the map of my life had a blank square. It wasn't vengeance. It was a pause, a careful, cold test to see what would happen when the scaffolding came down. The next morning the phone exploded. Calls stacked like wood in the corner. One voicemail was clipped and legal-scented. "Miss Morgan, this is Mr. Calloway. We need to talk about the mortgage." That's how normal culpability announces itself in polite, administrative tones. I dressed in a sweater that smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee, and for the first time climbed into the notion that returning could be for me, not only for them. The town outside the motel window looked exactly like the one I'd left, blinking holiday lights, the bakery's glass steamed, the same 2 lanes of road. Only now, every storefront felt like an observation, a place where an invisible ledger might be balanced if I let it be. I put on boots and stepped out, not because I believed I would be welcomed, but because I wanted to see the faces that had refused to be counted. Snow came down in a slow, polite way, the kind that softens edges and makes everything look temporarily kinder. I walked the main street like somebody testing the temperature of a city with the back of her hand. The bakery bell chimed. A woman 2 decades my senior smiled when she saw a uniform and said, "Welcome home." That one sentence was gasoline to a memory, me sliding a sticky donut across a counter, Haley somewhere in the world of scraped knees and sequins. The smile reminded me of a place that still used to take me in without a receipt. My neighborhood wasn't a museum of grief, it was a ledger of transactions disguised as memory. Childhood friends had become mortgage holders and church elders. The diner on Route 12, the one with vinyl booths and coffee that never got cold, was where people measured forgiveness in chipped mugs. For years, I'd been the invisible bill payer. For years, I had believed presence was measured in sending funds, not in conversations. That rational ledger kept me functioning until the night the texts arrived and showed me the terms of my membership in this family. They called, 7 missed calls, and 1 labeled Callaway and Green Law Office. The voicemail introduced legal language like an apology in military draft. If this creates further complications, it said, Pacific and clinical. Complications. The word sat on my tongue like a coin I didn't want to spend. I would have laughed if I'd felt light enough. Instead, I walked until the snow blurred the edges of the street and the town folded into the distance. Back at the motel, I opened a cheap bottle of whiskey and watched training footage because there is a comfort in discipline. Boot camp had been a clarifying fire. You either followed orders or you were left behind. With family, the rules were all tacit and punitive. We're a family, they said on text. They meant, we are permitted to take from you. I thought of the moment Dad used my savings for the roof, a project with no receipts. I thought of Haley's selfies next to a new car I'd helped buy. I thought of money as a language everyone in my childhood home spoke, but never taught me to translate. Public exposure is a weapon with a fine edge. I didn't set out to brand them as selfish, but I wanted the ledger visible. I created an album, plain and surgical, and titled it just that, just so we're clear. Inside were transaction histories, screenshots, and dates. No flourishes. No scolding. Just numbers. Sometimes truth needs a spreadsheet. The first comment pinged from a cousin. Lisa, are you serious? It's always the peripheral witnesses who give the most honest applause. The reaction detonated in 2 ways, private messages that read like confessions and public posts that read like dismay. Mom's page went quiet. Dad's profile swapped to a fishing picture like an animal hiding its tracks. Haley posted something bitter and bright, misdirected anger toward me as if I'd staged a scene for applause. When your family is a debtor, you are always the one expected to reconcile. I was tired of reconciling. They begged, of course. Fathers in their own narrative always know how to twist a guilt knot, chest pains, tears, the expected collapse of financial stability. You can't just abandon us, my sister texted, the message threaded with entitlement. It's amazing how quickly people recall we when I leaves the room. I didn't answer the calls that first day. Silence, I'd learned, is a tool in the field. It can be louder than an assault. The lawyer called again, more insistent. A mortgage company will send notices when autopay stops. They'll demand immediate attention. That administrative voice made my chest clench. Here the emotional world and the legal world meet like 2 fronts. My action had consequences, and I wasn't naive. But consequences are also the only thing that makes people reckon. So I set the meeting. Neutral ground. No shouting. No home field advantage. Dennis's Diner, Route 12, 6 p.m. I texted a time because I wanted a record. And because people who have spent a decade calling you at odd hours seldom plan to meet honestly. Forcing the calendar is a way to weaponize normalcy. That night, I lay awake counting receipts like prayers, not for absolution, but to know what I'd done. My chest wasn't pumping with triumph. It felt like a quiet readiness. The diner would be a stage. I would carry a folder. The world I'd left behind had built itself on my quiet sacrifices, and for the first time since basic, I intended to make them weigh them in public. The diners smelled like coffee and lemon oil. Booths hugged the floor. A jukebox murmured a song from 20 years ago. I picked the booth that let me see the door and every exit, old instincts for visibility that never leave. My folder lay heavy between my knees. It had been tabbed and arranged like a mission packet: mortgage statements, bank transfers, insurance receipts, even emails where I'd apologetically offered help. There was a kind of cold beauty in documentation. They arrived together, which was a calculated move. Family units often present as one body to conceal fractured bones. Dad's jaw set like visible metal, Haley's sunglasses indoors were both armor and performance, and my mother clutched her purse like a rosary. They slid in opposite me with practiced faces. I noticed Haley's fingers tremble as if the sunglasses had been the only steady thing in her hands. "We don't need to make this ugly," Dad said first, a tone that wanted control without explanation. Mom's voice fluttered in, soft as tissue paper. "We're a family. We can work through this." Haley's disdain was a quiet drumbeat. She sniffed and made a comment about my public shaming. The diner conversation began like a mediation, but smelled like a jury. I pushed the folder toward them. The receipts lay flat like evidence. Their eyes flicked, trying to translate numbers into excuses. "You humiliated us on Facebook, Lisa," Haley spat. That was low. My mother's face folded into hurt, a practice script that wants people to feel culpable for making others act. It's incredible how the wounded party can demand gentleness while demanding recompense. "You humiliated us," Dad echoed, louder. "You embarrassed your family." It's a phrase meant to weaponize shame. It makes accountability look like disrespect. I folded my hands and said, "I didn't write anything that wasn't true." I told them what looking at receipts felt like. Not like retaliation, but like finally seeing the arithmetic between what I gave and what I received. Haley tried the entitlement angle. "You didn't have to stop. We could have found a way." The logic assumed that my labor had no cost, that my presence on a spreadsheet was an extension of my love. I explained the logistics of autopay the same way I'd explain a map. Numbers linked to months, months to rent to the mortgage company's late notices. I watched their faces as the math translated to lost safety, not because they'd misunderstood the numbers, but because they'd been relying on invisible cushions forever. Dad's hands clenched. When men like him feel exposed, they make sound. "You think this makes you better than us?" he asked, which is not a question so much as a challenge. I told him I didn't want better. I wanted reciprocal. The word rooted in me like a small plant refusing to die in winter. Then Uncle Tom showed up, the twist neither of us expected nor wished for, but the kind that alters gravity. He walked in with a cane and a quiet that sounded like history. He sat down without dramatics, said hello to me as if he'd been holding breath for months. He'd always been the one who watched me. Small kindnesses not newsworthy, meals gifted without photos, a call when hospitals rang louder than emails. "You've always been useful," Dad started, defensive. Tom cut him off with a look that could silence a room. He told a story, not long, but precise. The night Lisa had flown across an ocean to sit by his bed when a scare landed him in the hospital. How she'd paid for a handyman when his gutters sat like teeth in the rain. Simple things that proved she wasn't somebody who kept score for drama. She did it because she saw people. Then Tom reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the table. It was a small, deliberate gesture. He said, "I updated it 2 weeks ago." No one moved. The envelope contained a will, Lisa as primary beneficiary for his modest home. The room contracted. There was legal finality in a paper that needs no assent. Dad's face strained. Haley's mouth formed an O that studied shock and rage. "This isn't revenge," Tom said quietly. "It's consequence." He met my eyes and nodded, small, like a benediction. The revelation didn't close the wound, it changed its map. Here was a tangible rebalancing, a transfer of agency that made my previous acts less radical and more inevitable. Haley lunged into accusation, claiming manipulation, betrayal, cruelty. The accusations were loud, the will was quieter, but heavier. I sat there and watched as the family, my old family, turned to face the results of its own arrangement. My folder of receipts had been the spark. Tom's will was the ember that ensured the fire altered the landscape. When the meeting broke, it broke in shards. Dad argued legal consequences and shame. Mom wept without clarity. Haley demanded my explanation like a verdict. I gathered my things, pocketing the folder and the taste of a revolution that had a name: autonomy. I walked out of the diner lighter in ways I didn't have language for yet, holding an inheritance that felt less like windfall and more like permission. That night the town's lights looked like small conspiracies. I sat in my rented room and reread old messages the way soldiers review after-action reports, to learn, not to lament. My phone erupted with calls, accusations, pleas, and the kind of performative sorrow that tries to turn a moral ledger into a melodrama. Yet none of it altered the wolf folded into my jacket. The law's quiet stamp had been the sound of responsibility being applied to those who'd shirked it. I went asleep with the window cracked. A cold band of air felt clean on my face. There's a strange clarity that comes after you upset a balance. The world looks the same, but where once you stood safe now there is only a different kind of openness. I didn't expect a parade. I didn't want a coronation. I wanted a line drawn. The next day the bank called. The mortgage company sent a notice. The lawyer from Calloway's office left a voicemail that threaded legal caution with moral outrage. There's still an obligation to discuss this, he said. They wanted to negotiate, to find remediation without the humiliation of admitting they'd been taking me for granted. They called it resolution. At noon I walked past the thrift shop where Haley used to buy band t-shirts. Her face was framed in a car window as she passed with two friends, laughing like she belonged to a world I'd been funding from afar. I felt a brief, human surge of loss, not for a house or a title, but for the picture of the sister I'd once wanted to rescue. I could have softened. For a second, I pictured ourselves at a kitchen table, plates clinking, trading apologies. Then I thought of every single time my presence had been counted like currency and not worth conversation. That memory hardened into an answer. The lawyer called again and asked for a mediated meeting. We can prevent litigation, he said, which implies the threat of courtroom theater. But what his voice translated to me was a hope that money might be restored without emotional participation, their preferred outcome. No one had considered that I might want more than restitution. I wanted recognition, small and real, not a cover-up. Haley posted a bitter thread that afternoon, all performative indignation and rhetorical flourishes. Family first, her caption read, as if slogans made amends. Comments piled like tinder. The public lens changed the argument from private hurt to spectacle. People chose sides instantly. Acquaintances I hadn't seen since high school messaged me with quiet utterances of disbelief and gratitude. Strangers became witnesses. Witnesses became allies. Social media, of all things, offered a kind of accountability that had been absent at my own table. Yet beneath the noise, something raw and personal remained, my own exhaustion. Walking the perimeter of my life for a decade had cost me small parts of myself. I'd turned my identity into a resource. The realization that I'd been used had its own cost. It required mourning. And then it required making decisions. So I sat across from the bank's notice, and instead of allowing panic, I prepared a plan. Uncle Tom's house was small, but it was a place. I could take a leave of absence and live in a home that was mine by legal right, not by the permission of someone else. Maybe I would host veterans there. Maybe I would paint the porch and keep it as a quiet map of what recovery looks like. Possibility is fragile after harm, but it's the only tool that revives you. When I returned to the diner to collect my folder, my father intercepted me in the parking lot. His voice broke in a way I'd never heard before. "Lisa," he said, "we're trying." We didn't know. There was something like fear springing up in him, a panic that had not been present when he texted me not to come. "We can fix this," he pleaded. Fix it. The verb assumed the problem was mine to repair. I looked at him and felt the line I had to walk, compassion without submission. I told him to speak with Mr. Calloway. That was the only honest reply. Inside the diner, Haley stood by the jukebox as if it were a witness. Her voice caught when she said, "You ruined everything." I told her quietly, "You ruined what you had the right to ruin." I stopped fixing things that weren't mine to fix. It was not an apology. It was a boundary. The days following were a tangle of calls, moderation attempts, and one remarkably human moment. Mom came to the door of my motel room. She stood in the hallway like someone who'd forgotten the key to her own house. "I'm sorry," she said without the performance. It was thin, but it was the first honest sound I'd heard from her. I watched her and for a moment wanted to reach for the old pattern of rescue. But then I remembered how many nights I had made myself small to let them be large. The moment passed. The bank demanded paperwork. Haley made threats. Dad threatened to contest the will, a bluster with legal teeth but practical weakness. I paid attention to each of these, but I also made a new list. Repairs the house needed, veterans I knew who could use a couch for a few nights, a neighbor who could be trusted to water plants. The climax that built toward wasn't a courtroom or a fight, it was the accumulation of quiet, practical acts that would make stewardship real, not spectacle. Courtrooms and fights didn't happen. The real reckoning occurred in ordinary, merciless detail, papers signed, notices filed, phone calls logged. That was the true theater, not of grand oratory, but of legal forms that translate emotion into deed. Calloway's office produced a stack of documents I could have signed in my sleep, affidavits, disclaimers, a schedule of payments that now belonged to no one. Each signature felt like a small unhooking. The day the mortgage company sent its first official notice of delinquency to my parents' address, their panic had teeth. They sped toward crisis like a ship finally noticing the leak. Dad called in a voice that wanted to be confident but couldn't find the tone. "We'll figure something out. We can refinance. Heal the wound, keep the structure." The assumption remained that someone else would take the strain. I started to manage the incoming chaos with the same kind of coldliness I'd used breaking autopay, procedural, precise. When the lawyer phoned requesting a sit-down, I agreed, but announced I would not be emotionally available for manipulation. I would only discuss what could be resolved by contractual adjustment and honest payment. My terms were dry and legal. They bristled. Haley continued to use outrage as a shield. She's young enough to assume outrage will return what she's lost. She did not include the years or the small acts of service that bought her privilege. Her voice on the phone was a litany of entitlement. "You knew we needed that money," she cried. She stated need like a right. "You can't just take away what keeps us afloat." She forgot to say she never once noticed the nights I wired funds or the times I changed my flight to help. I met with Uncle Tom at his little bungalow. He sat me down and said something that changed the shape of the last years. "You acted like family when many who were born it refused to," he told me, voice like worn leather. "I wanted to make sure you had a place that was yours." He gave me a key and the slow sound of an arrangement that carried the dignity of an ally. It wasn't reparations for a lifetime, no single paper can erase years, but it was a foundation. It mattered. The decisive moment came 2 weeks later when Haley's threats turned legal. She and Dad, furious and scared, pursued a contest of Tom's will. The local courthouse smelled of paper and jurisdictional patience. Calloway argued they had grounds to contest based on undue influence, on the sudden nature of changes. My voice throughout was not a conflagration. It was a ledger. I presented emails where Tom had explicitly discussed his wishes, I produced copies of the notarized will, and I read a short letter Tom had written to me 2 weeks prior, explaining why he'd signed the paper and why he wanted me to have his home. Sitting in that courtroom, I felt a strange thing, a loss of dramatic expectation. The battle wasn't between me and them, it was between the truth and the stories we had told ourselves to survive. The judge read through evidence with a boredom that was almost tenderness. Decision-making, after all, is a bureaucratic kind of mercy. When the judge refused to overturn the will, the room did not erupt. There was no triumphant music. Dad's jaw trembled with a rage that wasn't theatrical, it was a raw sense of having been exposed as dependent. Haley sobbed in the hallway, private and undignified. Tom's handwriting had done what years of conversation could not. The law had translated a quiet fidelity into ownership. I left the courthouse without a victory lap. The sensation was quieter, relief folded into a cautious newness. I had not humiliated anyone. I'd merely stopped loaning out my peace. The climax was not a tidy humiliation, but a reallocation of the future. The house was mine, legally and practically. The family's options narrowed to what their choices could sustain. That night, alone in the car outside Tom's bungalow, I realized the real work began after verdicts and signatures, furnishing the house, inviting vets who needed a corner of solace, learning how to ask for help without naming it duty. Freedom, in practice, requires the slow math of upkeep and compassion. It is not performed in social media albums. It is built with sweat and small kindnesses, and sometimes with a checkbook. I unlocked the bungalow's door and stepped into spaces that smelled like lemon oil and old books. The light cut across an empty room that felt enormous in a way I had not expected. For the first time in years, I could imagine a morning where I did not answer to the ping of someone else's need. That imagined morning felt like an armature. It would not be easy, but it would be mine. Winter loosened and then retreated. I spent the first month in Tom's house in that deliberate boredom new ownership sometimes demands, painting a porch, tightening a hinge, learning exactly how the furnace coughed in cold weather. Practicalities became a discipline. They ground me down and built me up. I learned the address where my name could be used without explanation. I learned to wake and not brace. People asked whether I felt victorious. The honest answer was no. What I felt was steadiness, a landscape altered by a decision that had nothing to do with spectacle. Time, not vindication, was the gift. It offered small acts that would add up, turning a bedroom into a place for a veteran friend, planting a maple in the yard, writing to Tom and telling him I was grateful in the blunt, adult way that lands. Mother sent a postcard 6 weeks after the will was public, a thin attempt at contact with floral script and no apology. It read like a bookmark in a book I once loved. I did not respond. Haley's messages dwindled to silence and then stopped. Dad called once, voice thin and apologetic. I let it go to voicemail and listen later. There are conversations you preserve for when you feel robust enough to manage the tide. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I wanted to be. The house's mantel held a single new photograph, Uncle Tom and me on his porch during a summer visit, laughing. We'd been caught mid-sentence, my uniform a speckled history, his hand on the banister a reliable shore. The look on his face was one of plain pride, the kind that doesn't demand slogans or an audience. It was the love of someone who had watched and acted. People online argued about whether I'd done the right thing. Comment sections became a confessional, moral tribunal, and sometimes a place of real solace. Veterans wrote about the exhaustion of invisibility. Other young adults wrote about the labor of invisible caregiving. Someone messaged to say they'd used my story to muster the courage to set a boundary. That, oddly, felt like a decent outcome. If freedom felt like a wildfire people tend to romanticize, then my freedom was a lantern. Small, deliberate, dependable. The house was not a palace. It was a place that needed painting and a lawn that needed mowing and neighbors who still hadn't fully forgiven the way family had been handled. But the chores were honest work. They didn't require apology. They required presence. I began slow experiments. One bedroom became a respite room for veterans between towns, a couch and a warm lamp, coffee and a kettle that could listen. The first man to stay, a kid named Marcus with a nickname that suggested he'd once been quick with laughter, left a note on the fridge that said, "Thank you, we'll pay it forward." The words sat there like a measure of justice. People sometimes ask if I regret making the transfers public. I don't. The ledger had to be seen. For me, privacy had been a contract that preserved an unequal exchange. Transparency forced a negotiation. It also fractured some things beyond repair, but not everything that matters is reparable, and some damages are inevitable in the currency of boundaries. I think back to that motel room where I first turned the auto-pay off. There was a strange thrill in the smallness of the act and the largeness of its consequences. The decision had been selfish in the best sense. It was meant to preserve my life. It was meant to stop me from being a pipeline for other people's stunted growth. As seasons turned, I learned to let the silence be not punishment, but the space to reconfigure. I didn't block memories as if they were threats. I honored them as evidence. I left a key to Tom's bungalow with Marcus when he moved on. I wrote to my parents only once, months later, and said thank you for things they had done well and no more. Words can be a map. Sometimes they are a gate. I still don't know who I'll be next. Maybe I'll run the house as a tiny refuge for people who, like me, learned how to give until they needed shelter. Maybe I'll ship postcards to far-flung friends and fill the mantle with different faces. For now I stand in a small kitchen that is mine and drink coffee that no longer tastes like someone else's debt. If you ask whether I did the right thing, the answer is quiet and lived in. I survived it. Sometimes survival is the bravest narrative we can write. And when survival comes with the chance to be generous on our own terms, we make a better kind of inheritance than anyone could promise.